In the town of Millbrook Falls, where the river bends twice before it reaches the mill, there was a small shop on the corner of Elm and Third with a bell above the door that never stopped ringing true. The sign above the window read, "Hartwell Clocks and Watches," and behind the counter, for 61 years, stood a man named Elias Hartwell. Elias was not a man anyone noticed twice. He wore the same grey wool vest through every season, patched at the elbow more than once. His hands were small and steady, built for delicate work, for turning tiny screws and setting fragile gears into motion. He fixed pocket watches for farmers and wall clocks for the church and, later, wristwatches for school teachers and mechanics. He charged fair prices and never once raised them out of spite or need. He had come to Millbrook Falls in 1958, a young man of 23, with a leather satchel of tools inherited from his father and almost nothing else. His father had been a watchmaker too, in a small city 300 miles east, and had taught Elias the trade at a workbench in their kitchen, insisting that a boy who could not sit still for an hour would never learn to fix anything worth fixing. Elias learned patience before he learned mechanics, and only later understood that his father had taught him the harder lesson first on purpose. When his father died, Elias took the tools, the satchel, and little else, and set out to find a town that did not already have a clockmaker of its own. He rented the shop for $11 a month and slept in the back room for the first 2 years, until he had saved enough to afford a small apartment above the hardware store. He ate simply, mended his own clothes, and spent his evenings reading repair manuals by lamplight, determined to be the kind of craftsman that people trusted with things that mattered to them. The pocket watch passed down from a grandfather, the mantel clock that had ticked through a family's holidays for 3 generations. He rented the shop for $11 a month and slept in the back room for the first 2 years, until he had saved enough to afford a small apartment above the hardware store. He ate simply, mended his own clothes, and spent his evenings reading repair manuals by lamplight, determined to be the kind of craftsman that people trusted with things that mattered to them. The pocket watch passed down from a grandfather, the mantel clock that had ticked through a family's holidays for 3 generations. Mr. Abernathy tapped the counter with one finger and said that he had watched dozens of railroad men try to grow rich quickly, chasing one hot tip after another, and every one of them had ended up poorer than when they started. The men who ended up comfortable, he said, were almost always the dullest men in the room, the ones who put a little aside every month and forgot about it, the way a farmer forgets about a seed once it is properly planted. Elias listened the way he listened to a clock that was not quite right, carefully, without interrupting, turning the idea over in his mind the way he turned a gear between his fingers, checking it from every angle before he trusted it to run. The following month, he opened an account and placed in it $22, the profit from a slow week of repairs. He did the same the next month. And the month after that, he did not tell anyone. He simply kept a small ledger, the same kind he used to track parts and repairs, and in the back pages, in his careful, cramped handwriting, he recorded every deposit. The 1960s passed gently. Elias married a schoolteacher named Ruth in 1963, and though they never had children of their own, they took in Ruth's orphaned niece Clara for 2 summers when her parents were ill, and the girl came to think of the clock shop as a second home. Ruth kept the shop's books alongside her teaching, and she alone knew about the ledger, though even she did not know how large the numbers had grown, because Elias rarely mentioned it and never bragged. On summer evenings, the 3 of them would sit on the small porch behind the shop, Clara sorting through a tin of spare watch hands and gears as though they were treasure, while Ruth graded papers and Elias oiled his tools for the next day's work. Clara would later say that some of her happiest memories were of those quiet evenings, where nobody seemed to want for anything more than the porch light and each other's company. In 1973, the markets fell hard and kept falling into the following year. Neighbors spoke of ruin at the diner and the barber shop. Elias heard the talk. He said nothing and he did not sell. He simply continued his monthly deposit, now grown to $60, exactly as he always had. Mr. Abernathy, before he passed, had told him that the falling years were not the danger. The danger was a man's own fear getting the better of his patience. The 1980s brought prosperity to Millbrook Falls, a new bridge, an expanded schoolhouse, and Elias raised his prices only once, by a single dollar per repair, apologizing to every customer who asked. In October of 1987, the market dropped further in a single day than most had ever seen. Elias read about it in the evening paper, folded the page closed, and went back to fitting a new mainspring into an old grandfather clock. His deposit that month did not change. Ruth died quietly in her sleep in the winter of 1991, and Elias grieved in the only way he knew, by working. He kept the shop open 6 days a week, and he kept depositing, now nearly $200 some months, into the account that only he and Ruth had ever known about. Clara, grown now and living 2 towns over with a family of her own, would visit on Sundays, and Elias would ask about her children and say very little about himself. The dot-com collapse of the early 2000s wiped away fortunes built overnight on companies that made nothing at all. Elias had never owned a single one of those companies. His fund held pieces of hundreds of ordinary businesses, the kind that made bread and steel and shoes, and though the fund's value dipped, it did not vanish, and Elias, now in his 60s himself, did not blink. He raised his monthly deposit again. Business was good. He had by then trained a young apprentice named Thomas, a quiet boy from the next county who reminded Elias of himself at that age, right down to the way the boy held a screwdriver as though it might break if he gripped it wrong. Elias taught him the same way his father had taught him, slowly, without shortcuts, insisting that a watch repaired carelessly was worse than a watch left broken. In the evenings, after the shop closed, Elias sometimes spoke to Thomas about patience, though never once about the ledger hidden away at home, believing that a young man needed to learn the value of steady work before he learned anything about steady saving. In 2008, the financial crisis arrived like a winter storm nobody had forecast. Banks failed. Neighbors lost homes. The hardware store beneath Elias's old apartment closed its doors for good. Thomas, frightened by the news each night, asked Elias if they ought to pull the savings out before it was too late. Elias set down the watch he was working on and told him plainly that panic was the most expensive habit a man could keep, and that the market had recovered from every fall in its history, given enough time and enough patience. He did not sell a single share. He kept depositing, as he always had. By 2015, Elias was 80 years old and had slowed his work to 4 days a week, though he refused every suggestion of retirement. Thomas had taken over most of the repairs, but customers still asked for Elias by name, trusting his old hands over any other. The ledger, kept now in a small fireproof box beneath his bed, rather than in a drawer at the shop, held a number that Elias himself had stopped calculating precisely. He knew only that it was large. He never once considered it his to spend freely. He still wore the same grey vest, now 3 times patched. When the pandemic struck in 2020, the markets fell faster than they ever had before, and just as quickly began to climb again. Elias, confined to his small apartment at 85, watched the news with the same steady patience he brought to a broken clock, believing, as he always had, that time would set things right if a man simply let it. He passed away peacefully in his sleep in March of 2023, at the age of 88, having never once withdrawn a dollar from the account he opened in 1960. Clara, now the executor of his modest estate, expected little beyond the shop's old tools and a lifetime of watch parts. She found the fireproof box while clearing his apartment, tucked beneath a stack of folded newspapers. Inside was the small leather ledger, its pages soft with age, and a single folded brokerage statement from the month before he died. The account held $3,118,000. Clara sat on the edge of his narrow bed for a long while, holding the ledger that recorded, in his careful handwriting, 63 years of $22 deposits, grown patient and quiet into a fortune. She thought of the vest he refused to replace, and the prices he refused to raise, and the fear he refused to give into during every collapse the world had thrown at him. She remembered, too, the summer evenings on the porch, and understood only now what those quiet, unremarkable nights had actually been. The patient accumulation of a man's entire philosophy, practiced not just with money, but with everything he touched, every gear, every customer, every year he refused to hurry through. Thomas, by then a grown man running the shop on his own, wept when Clara told him the number. Not from the size of it, but from the years of quiet mornings he had spent beside a man who had never once let on what he was building. He told Clara that Elias used to say a watch only kept good time if nobody rushed it, and that he supposed, in the end, the old man had been talking about more than watches all along. She used a portion of the money to endow a scholarship at the county trade school for young people learning skilled crafts, naming it for both Elias and Ruth. She restored the old clock shop as a small museum of his tools and his life's work, and above the door she hung a simple plaque. It read that wealth was not made in a single moment of brilliance, but in 63 years of a man who refused to stop and who was never once afraid to wait. The town still tells the story of the quiet clockmaker on the corner of Elm and Third, the man who mended watches for pocket change and left behind a fortune nobody suspected. Built one patient month at a time, one small deposit after another, for longer than most people are willing to wait for anything at all. Beneath the museum's glass, his old ledger still sits open to its final page, a small and steady record of a life that never once stopped believing in the quiet arithmetic of time.